Miss Marple and the Young Widow, Too Beautiful to be Innocent. Chapter 1. The Garden Party at Thornfield. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Thornfield Manor, where Margaret Ashford had decided to host her most ambitious garden party in years. At 86, Miss Marple, who preferred to be called simply Miss Marple by those who knew her, well sat beneath a white parasol, a cup of Earl Grey cooling in her lap. She had come because Margaret had insisted, and because the village of Thornfield held an endless supply of human nature to observe. "Isn't it just divine?" whispered Dorothy Chen, settling into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple. Dorothy, the vicar's wife, had that particular kind of nervous energy that always preceded important gossip. Though I must say, nobody expected Victoria to appear. After everything, Miss Marple's pale blue eyes betrayed nothing, though her attention sharpened like a bird-noting movement in grass. She had learned decades ago that the most revealing moments came when people believed you weren't truly listening. Victoria Hartley was impossible to miss. She moved through the garden like a figure from a painting, dark hair, perfectly arranged, a cream linen dress that managed to be simultaneously modest and impossibly elegant. At 28, she had been the widow of Sir Edmund Hartley for precisely 4 months. The village had spent those 4 months deciding exactly what to think of her. "My dear, she is his widow," Miss Marple observed mildly, setting down her teacup. "It would be rather strange if she didn't attend social gatherings eventually." Dorothy leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Yes, but Edmund has only been dead for months. And the manner of it," she paused dramatically. "Well, some are saying it was rather convenient, his heart attack. For her, I mean, it was the sort of statement that required careful handling." Miss Marple had found over the years that the best response to village speculation was often silence. Dorothy, undeterred, pressed on. "She married him for his money, everyone knows it. And now she's free. 28 years old, a widow with a fortune, and not a soul to answer to." Dorothy's expression suggested this combination represented either the greatest tragedy or greatest triumph. In modern history, she hadn't quite decided which. Across the garden, Victoria was speaking with James Northcott, the village's most prominent businessman and owner of the local textile mill. He was 52, with the sort of prosperous middle age that came from being born into wealth and never having to worry about losing it. As Miss Marple watched, Victoria smiled at something he said, genuine smile, not the careful expression she'd worn when accepting condolences at Edmund's funeral. "James Northcott seems quite taken with her," Dorothy continued. "His wife died 7 years ago, and he's never shown interest in remarrying. Until now." Miss Marple sipped her tea. James Northcott had married his first wife, Catherine, at 23. They had produced one daughter, Elizabeth, now 24, and had lived what appeared to be the perfect union. Catherine's death from influenza had been sudden and had affected him deeply, or so it had seemed. But Miss Marple had noticed, even then, the way his eyes occasionally strayed during his period of mourning. The way his attention had lingered, for instance, on the young piano teacher who came to Thornfield Village every Thursday. "I wonder," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "whether Mr. Northcott's interest is in Mrs. Hartley herself, or in the novelty of her situation." Dorothy blinked. "What do you mean?" "Only that a widow of considerable means, young and alone, must be rather a change from the usual social calendar. Though I confess I find myself curious about one thing." "What's that?" "Why Victoria Hartley came to Thornfield in the first place." Edmund was a London man entirely. They married in London lived in London, had not realized they'd ever spent any significant time here. This observation seemed to trouble Dorothy, who frowned as though attempting to recall something just beyond reach. I'm not entirely certain. They took the cottage Willow End, you know, the one by the church about 8 months ago. Edmund said something about wanting a quiet place for Victoria, away from the city. He was already quite ill by then. 8 months. Victoria had come to Thornfield while Edmund was already in declining health. Miss Marple found herself wondering what had motivated that particular decision. A dying man, his young wife, and a retreat to a village where neither had any prior connection. It was precisely the sort of pattern that, in her experience, often concealed something. "I do hope," Miss Marple said, changing the subject with the expertise of someone who had mastered the art of village conversation, "that the strawberries are particularly good this year. I noticed them at the market last week. They seemed rather exceptional." But even as Dorothy eagerly seized upon this safer topic, Miss Marple's attention remained divided. She watched Victoria, who had excused herself from James Northcote's company and was now speaking with 2 other women. Margaret Ashford's niece, Clara Winters, and Michael Ashford, Margaret's grandson, who had recently returned from Oxford. Michael, Miss Marple noted with the sort of observation that had served her well for nearly 7 decades, could barely look away from Victoria. His hands gestured with unusual agitation, and there was a flush in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon warmth. Clara, however, watched them both with an expression that suggested she was calculating something. Clara worked as a secretary at the local solicitor's office and had, Miss Marple had gathered, a sharp mind for details and a sharp tongue when gossip was in order. The garden party continued around them in a pleasant hum of conversation and the gentle clink of china. But Miss Marple found herself cataloguing details with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that truth, like flowers, often grew in unexpected places beneath the surface. Victoria Hartley was too beautiful to be innocent. That was what the village wanted to believe, anyway. But Miss Marple had learned that assumptions about beauty were often the first place where human judgment failed most spectacularly. It was exactly at 3 o'clock, as Margaret was preparing to serve the desserts, that young Thomas, who worked in the Ashford Gardens, came hurrying across the lawn with the expression of someone bringing news of significant consequence. He went directly to Margaret, leaning in and whispering something urgently. Margaret's face went quite pale. Within moments, the pleasant afternoon was transformed. The news spread with the speed such news always does in small villages. Sir Edmund Hartley's body had been discovered in the woods near Willow End, some distance from the cottage, and he had not died of a heart attack after all. Someone, it seemed, had shot him. Chapter 2. The village reacts the news of Edmund. Hartley's death spread through Thornfield with the efficiency of water finding cracks in stone. By evening, every household knew the details, or rather, every household knew the version of details that had been filtered through no fewer than 7 retellings, each one adding speculation where fact was absent. Miss Marple learned the particulars from Constable Webb, who arrived at her cottage on Church Lane at 6:30 with a cup of tea and the kind of expression men wear when they are genuinely troubled. Webb had been the village constable for 15 years and had the good sense to value Miss Marple's insight, even if he didn't always understand why. "Shot," he confirmed, settling into her comfortable chair with obvious relief at being somewhere calm. Twice, the doctor says. Professional work, or so Inspector Harrow suggested when he arrived from the county. No robbery. Edmund's wallet was still on him, his watch intact. Nothing taken from the scene. Where exactly was he found? Miss Marple asked, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She was working on a cardigan for the church bazaar, a task that seemed to occupy her hands, while her mind engaged more serious matters, in Ashford Woods, about a quarter-mile from Willow End. The cottage is set rather isolated. You understand, good for privacy, but rather exposed if one is walking the grounds. A local girl, Sarah Hutchins, was taking a shortcut through the woods to visit her grandmother when she spotted him. Quite traumatized, poor thing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The Hutchins girl was 17, sensible, and not given to hysteria. If she had been truly distressed, Edmund's position must have been rather undeniable. And Mrs. Hartley? Miss Marple inquired gently. How is she managing? Constable Webb shifted uncomfortably. That's rather the peculiar part, Miss Marple. When the inspector went to inform her, she was remarkably composed. Almost. He paused, searching for the word. Well, almost as though she expected it. The knitting needles continued their rhythm. Click, click, click. How long ago did Edmund die? Do we know? The doctor estimates sometime between noon and 2 o'clock yesterday. Victoria Mrs. Hartley claimed she was at home all day. Says Edmund left in the morning for a walk and didn't return. She assumed he'd gone into the village for a drink at the pub, when he wasn't back by evening. She said she grew worried but thought perhaps he'd taken shelter somewhere due to the weather. There was rain, you'll recall. Miss Marple did recall. There had been a brief but heavy shower around 1:30, the sort that came and went with spring's unpredictability. She remembered because it had driven several people indoors at the garden party, and Margaret had fretted about whether the cream would be adequately chilled. So no one can verify her whereabouts? Miss Marple asked. No one. The cottage is isolated. She claims she didn't go out, but there are no witnesses to confirm it. And that's precisely why half the village is already convinced she did it. Constable Webb sighed deeply. Inspector Harrow is due back tomorrow with his full investigative team. They'll be examining the body properly, looking for the weapon, questioning everyone. But Miss Marple, you know how these things go. The widow with the young face and the recent fortune is going to be precisely the person everyone assumes is guilty. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the constable with the sort of expression that suggested she was seeing considerably more than what was immediately visible. And what do you believe, Constable Webb? He was quiet for a long moment. I believe that Victoria Hartley is exactly what she appears to be, a woman who married a dying man, probably for his money, and is now free of him. But belief and proof are different matters entirely. And I also believe that the village's conviction is worth rather less than the weather. Quite right, Miss Marple said, though I would add that the most dangerous conviction of all is the one that makes us stop looking further. People tend to see what they expect to see, don't they? By the following morning, the entire village had constructed its narrative. Victoria Hartley had married Edmund for his considerable fortune. Edmund, already unwell, had represented nothing but an obstacle to her freedom. It was a simple story, and the village clung to it with the determination of drowning. People clinging to wreckage at the village's central gathering point, the tea room run by Mrs. Patterson. The speculation was relentless. Miss Marple sat at her usual corner table, ostensibly reading the newspaper. though her ears were engaged in the surrounding conversation with remarkable acuity. She probably poisoned him first, suggested Mrs. Hartwell, who had been the village's leading gossip for the past decade. That's why he was always ill. And then, when poison was too slow, she simply shot him. But Edmund was perfectly healthy until quite recently, countered her. I saw him at the market in February. He seemed entirely well. That's precisely what poisoning is, Mrs. Hartwell said triumphantly. Slow, invisible, until it's too late. Miss Marple turned a page of her newspaper without comment, though her expression suggested she was storing observations rather than reading news. James Northcott appeared at the tea room around 11 o'clock, looking harried in a way that suggested the news had disrupted his morning considerably. He ordered tea and sat at a table near the window, but his attention was clearly directed toward the conversation happening at the center of the room. It's terrible. Absolutely terrible, he was heard to say to no one in particular. Edmund was not a close friend, but still. And in Thornfield, of all places. We don't have violence here. Miss Marple noted, however, that his expression suggested something more complex than simple distress. There was, perhaps, a hint of calculation in the way his eyes narrowed when Victoria's name was mentioned, the way his fingers tapped against the table with a peculiar rhythm by afternoon. Inspector Harrow had established a makeshift investigation center in the village hall. He was a man in his 50s, with the appearance of someone who had spent considerable time solving problems that most people preferred not to acknowledge. He had, reportedly, already indicated that Victoria Hartley would remain at the top of his suspect list. Motive, he'd been heard to say. Opportunity, and a remarkable lack of grief. Those are generally the foundations of successful investigation. But as the evening fell on Thornfield, and the village settled into the kind of excitement that only a genuine mystery could bring, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting and her thoughts. The sun was setting in shades of amber and rose. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Inspector Harrow's investigation began with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that murder, like most human endeavors, followed patterns. He interviewed Victoria first, which surprised no one, and found her remarkably forthcoming in a way that simultaneously confirmed and complicated the villagers' suspicions. I married Edmund knowing he was unwell, she stated clearly, seated in the village hall's small office with Inspector Harrow across from her and Constable Webb taking notes. Her composure was striking cold, but managed with the care of someone accustomed to controlling her environment. He was honest about his condition. The doctors gave him perhaps 2 years. We had for months. I was grateful for the time we had. And yet you seem remarkably unmoved by his death, Harrow observed. His pen poised above his notebook. Victoria met his gaze directly. I grieve privately, Inspector. Edmund preferred discretion in all things, including emotion. I think he would have appreciated my restraint. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, which somehow made it more suspicious. Miss Marple, observing from a chair near the wall where she'd been permitted to sit, Constable Webb having mentioned that her presence often clarified matters, noted the slight tension in Victoria's shoulders. The woman was controlling herself, certainly, but the effort was visible if one knew where to look. Tell me about your morning, Harrow continued. The day Edmund died. Edmund woke early, as he always did. He took his medication. He had several prescriptions. We had breakfast together around 7 o'clock. He seemed in reasonable spirits, though the weather was threatening. Around 9, He said he wanted to take a walk. I suggested he wait until the afternoon, after the rain, but he was restless. He often was. Being confined bothered him, and you didn't accompany him. He preferred to walk alone. The paths in Ashford Woods were his favorite. He discovered them during our first week here. I respected his desire for solitude. Harrow exchanged a glance with Constable Webb, so no one saw him leave the cottage. No one can verify his movements. Not that I'm aware of. The cottage is somewhat isolated. We didn't have neighbors in the immediate vicinity. Convenient, Harrow murmured, making a note. Victoria's eyes flashed just barely, just for a moment. Isolation was precisely the reason Edmund chose it. He wanted privacy. He wanted to spend his remaining time away from the scrutiny he felt in London. I would hardly consider that convenient for anything other than his own peace of mind. Miss Marple, whose knitting had accompanied her even to the village hall, watched Victoria's hands. They were steady, but there was a quality to her stillness that suggested profound tension beneath the surface. The woman was frightened, Miss Marple concluded. But whether she was frightened of being suspected or frightened of something else entirely remained unclear. Over the following 2 days, Inspector Harrow conducted interviews with everyone in the village who had known Edmund or had been present at the garden party. Miss Marple, permitted to attend each interview under the guise of village historian and keeper of local knowledge, observed far more than she contributed. James Northcote proved himself remarkably nervous for a man of considerable standing. When asked about his relationship with Victoria, he became defensive immediately. "I barely know the woman," he insisted, though his agitation suggested otherwise. "We spoke briefly at Margaret's garden party. That was the extent of our acquaintance." Yet when Harrow pressed about whether he'd seen Edmund on the day of his death, Northcote hesitated just long enough to be notable. "No, I was at the mill all day. My workers can verify my presence." "But you walk through Ashford Woods regularly," Harrow observed. "It wasn't a question. I do. It's a pleasant route to the mill from my house. But not that day. The weather was poor." Miss Marple made a mental note. James Northcote was many things: ambitious, calculating, accustomed to getting what he wanted, but she had rarely seen him lie. His present discomfort suggested something more complicated than simple guilt. Clara Winters, interviewed the following afternoon, displayed an entirely different quality of unease. Margaret's niece was sharp-featured and sharp-tongued, with the kind of intelligence that often went underutilized in positions suited to her gender and station. "Everyone knows Victoria married Edmund for his money," Clara said flatly. "It's hardly controversial. Edmund was dying. He wanted company, or perhaps he wanted to feel young again. Victoria wanted security. It was a transaction dressed up as romance." "Did you see Victoria on the morning Edmund died?" Harrow asked. "No, I was at the solicitor's office all morning. We were cataloguing some property documents, but I saw her in the village the previous day. She was peculiar, actually, walking alone through the village, looking at the houses as though she was seeing them for the first time, though she'd lived here for months." "Peculiar how?" Clara hesitated, searching for words, as though she was memorizing something, or perhaps saying goodbye. "It's difficult to explain." Miss Marple, who had been quiet throughout most of the interviews, found herself speaking for the first time. "Did she seem distressed?" Clara considered this. "No, thoughtful, perhaps, but not distressed. More resolved, I suppose, as though she'd reached some kind of decision. Young Michael Ashford, Margaret's grandson, was interviewed on the third day. He proved to be precisely what Miss Marple had suspected, thoroughly infatuated with Victoria, Hartley, and consumed with guilt over that infatuation. His answers were so tangled with emotion that they were virtually useless as investigation, though they revealed considerably about his character. "I barely spoke to her," he insisted, his face flushed. "Just at the garden party. I certainly had nothing to do with Edmund's death. And Victoria couldn't have done it. You simply don't understand her." "Tell me what I don't understand," Harrow said mildly. But Michael could not. He simply kept repeating that she was kind, that she was gentle, that she hadn't deserved to be married to a man like Edmund Hartley in the first place. By the end of the third day, the investigation had produced several interesting facts, but very little progress. Edmund had been shot with a .32 caliber pistol, weapon favored for discretion rather than power. No gun had been recovered. No one had been seen near Ashford Woods at the relevant time. Victoria Hartley had no witnesses to her whereabouts, which was suspicious, but she also had no obvious bloodstains, no powder residue on her hands, and no demonstrable knowledge of firearms. Inspector Harrow seemed frustrated, which meant he was relying more heavily on suspicion than evidence, precisely the kind of investigation that Miss Marple found both typical and troubling. "The widow did it," he declared to Constable Webb and Miss Marple on the evening of the third day. "She has motive, opportunity, and no alibi. We simply need to find the weapon and evidence of her knowledge of firearms. These details are merely procedural obstacles." "Or," Miss Marple said quietly, setting down her knitting, "they are evidence that your most obvious suspect is not, in fact, guilty." Harrow turned to her with the expression of a man who has been told something he does not wish to hear. "You have another theory?" "I have observations," Miss Marple replied carefully. "Nothing so definitive as a theory, but I have noticed that Victoria Hartley came to Thornfield 8 months ago, to a place where she had no connections." Chapter 4. The obvious suspect in Inspector Harrow's certainty about Victoria Hartley's guilt hardened over the following days, precisely as Miss Marple had feared it would. Certainty, she had observed, was the enemy of investigation. Once a man had decided upon his theory, evidence became merely decoration rather than guidance. By the 4th day after Edmund's death, Harrow had constructed a narrative so tidy that it required almost no actual proof. Victoria had married a dying man for his considerable fortune. Impatient with waiting, she had shot him during a morning walk, a location chosen specifically to avoid witnesses. The isolation of Willow End meant no one could verify her presence or absence. Her composure following the murder was not the result of innocence, but of a calculated performance designed to appear above suspicion. "The arrogance of it," Harrow said, pacing the village hall as though the act of walking might generate evidence. She believed herself too beautiful, too clever, to be caught. These crimes often hinge on the perpetrator's absolute conviction that their intelligence exceeds that of the investigation. Miss Marple, listening from her customary corner, found this assessment both familiar and troubling. In her experience, the crimes that hinged on such arrogance were precisely the ones that were solved through conventional means, which meant that the truly dangerous criminals were those who did not rely on their own superiority, but on careful observation of human nature. Victoria, whatever else she might be, did not seem to Miss Marple to be arrogant. The arrest came on the 5th day, a Friday morning when the village was just beginning its weekend routines. Harrow arrived at Willow End with 2 constables and a warrant, conducting the apprehension with the kind of ceremony that ensured the entire village would know within the hour. Miss Marple learned the news from Constable Webb, who appeared at her cottage looking genuinely troubled. She didn't resist, he reported, accepting the tea Miss Marple offered. Didn't protest or deny anything. Simply gathered a few things and went quietly. It was almost as though she expected it. Expected arrest, or expected something else. Miss Marple asked. Webb considered this. I couldn't say, but the look on her face, it wasn't fear, Miss Marple. It was something more like resignation, as though this was the conclusion she'd been anticipating all along. The village's reaction was divided but vocal. Mrs. Hartwell and her associates declared themselves vindicated. They had known all along. They insisted that Victoria was guilty. The younger generation, including Michael Ashford, protested vehemently that some terrible mistake had been made. James Northcott remained conspicuously silent. Though his absence from public gatherings became increasingly notable, the magistrates scheduled preliminary hearings, and the case began to assume the kind of weight that serious criminal matters possessed. A solicitor from the county was retained to represent Victoria, a capable woman named Miss Herringsworth, who took her role with appropriate gravity. It was Miss Herringsworth who first came to call on Miss Marple. 3 days after the arrest, Constable Webb suggested I speak with you, the solicitor explained, seated in Miss Marple's parlour with a cup of tea that she did not touch. He indicated that you possess considerable insight into village matters and have observed details that the official investigation may have overlooked. Miss Marple regarded her visitor carefully. Miss Herringsworth was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that suggested both intelligence and the exhaustion that came from fighting battles in an imperfect system. I have made certain observations, Miss Marple acknowledged, though I confess I am uncertain whether they constitute evidence or merely the musings of an old woman with too much time for speculation. I would be grateful for any insight, Miss Herringsworth said, because my client, Mrs. Hartley, is remarkably unhelpful in her own defense. When I ask her to provide witnesses to her whereabouts, she becomes vague. When I ask her whether she has fired a weapon, she will neither confirm nor deny it. And when I ask her directly whether she killed her husband, she simply says, the answer to that question is more complicated than yes or no. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. What precisely do you wish to know? Everything you've observed about the relationships in this village. About Victoria specifically, yes, but also about Edmund, James Northcott, Clara Winters, Michael Ashford, everyone connected to this case. Inspector Harrow has built a tidy narrative, but tidy narratives are often the least reliable. Over the course of the following hour, Miss Marple shared her observations with the solicitor. She described Victoria's genuine smile directed at James Northcott. She mentioned the curious fact that Edmund had come to Thornfield at all, a man whose entire life had been rooted in London. She noted the peculiarity of Clara's description, Victoria saying goodbye to the village the day before Edmund's death. What you're suggesting, Miss Herringsworth said slowly, is that Victoria Hartley came to Thornfield with purpose. Not randomly, but deliberately. I am suggesting, Miss Marple corrected gently, that we should ask ourselves why. Why would a young woman marry a dying man and then move with him to a village where she had no connections? Why would she seem resigned to arrest rather than frightened? And most importantly, why would she refuse to defend herself? Miss Herringsworth stood, her expression sharpened by new understanding. Because she's protecting someone. Miss Marple did not confirm this, but her silence was confirmation enough. The solicitor departed with new purpose, leaving Miss Marple alone with her knitting and her thoughts. Outside, the village continued its rhythms, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. Victoria Hartley sat in the county jail, neither defending herself nor confessing. Inspector Harrow prepared his case for trial, confident in his certainty. And somewhere in Thornfield, the person who had actually fired the fatal shots moved through daily life with whatever burden such knowledge carried. Miss Marple found herself thinking about James Northcote's nervousness, about the way his fingers had tapped that peculiar rhythm, deliberate, patterned, as though counting something, about the fact that he had denied being in Ashford Woods on the morning of Edmund's death, yet had seemed uncomfortable with the question. She was also thinking about Victoria's hands, steady, controlled, but belonging to a woman who was clearly accustomed to managing far more complicated situations than simple widowhood. The hands of someone who had endured considerable hardship and had learned to survive, by appearing to be something she was not. The following morning, a letter arrived for Miss Marple. It was in Victoria's handwriting, posted from the county jail. Dear Miss Marple, I am aware that you have observed things others have not. I am writing to ask you, with utmost sincerity, to stop. There are circumstances and relationships that are more important than justice or guilt. Some truths, when exposed, destroy innocent people. I accepted my arrest because it was the only way to protect what matters most. Please do not undo that protection through further investigation. I trust you understand. Victoria Hartley, Miss Marple, read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She understood, certainly. She understood that Victoria had sacrificed herself to shield someone, and she understood that the identity of that person was the key to everything. But understanding and knowing were different matters entirely, and the question that haunted her as she resumed her knitting was whether protecting the guilty was the same as permitting them to escape justice. Chapter 5. The hidden Clutha letter from Victoria troubled Miss Marple more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. It represented a choice between what she knew to be true and what the law demanded to be proven. She spent the following day in her garden, ostensibly pruning roses but actually engaged in the kind of careful thinking that required both solitude and occupation. It was on this day that Constable Webb appeared with news that would have gone unnoticed by anyone less accustomed to observing. Details, the solicitor requested. I look into Edmund's medical history, Webb explained, settling into the garden chair with the comfortable ease of someone who visited frequently. Miss Herringsworth thought perhaps there was something in his condition that might be relevant. I've been in contact with his London physician, and Miss Marple prompted, setting down her pruning shears, and apparently Edmund had been managing a heart condition for several years. Nothing extraordinary, the doctor said. Thousands of men lived with similar conditions. But here's what struck me as peculiar. Edmund's prescriptions were quite recent. He'd had them refilled only 2 weeks before coming to Thornfield. The medications would have lasted another 4 months, easily. Miss Marple straightened, her attention fully engaged. Yet when he arrived in Thornfield, he required new prescriptions. Exactly. He went to Dr. Pemberton, our village physician, within days of arriving, said he needed local prescriptions for convenience. But the medications were nearly identical to what he was already taking. Why would a man obtain duplicates of medications he already possessed? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, unless the duplicates served a different purpose than the originals. Webb looked uncomfortable. You're suggesting someone switched them? That Edmund's medications were altered? I'm suggesting nothing so definitive, Miss Marple said carefully. But I would be curious to know what those medications were, and whether anyone in Thornfield would have had access to them. The inquiry that followed revealed something that Inspector Harrow had entirely overlooked in his haste to arrest. Victoria, Dr. Pemberton's records showed that Edmund had indeed obtained new prescriptions, but one in particular was significant, a medication for his heart condition that required careful dosing. The correct dose was 1 tablet twice daily. An overdose would produce severe cardiac distress. It's possible, Dr. Pemberton told Constable Webb, that Edmund became confused about his dosing after switching to new prescriptions. Elderly patients sometimes do. If he'd taken 2 tablets at once, or taken doses in closer succession than recommended, he could have induced a serious cardiac episode. Could such an episode be mistaken for a heart attack? Webb asked. Absolutely. The symptoms would be identical. The presentation would be identical. Without a toxicology report, one would assume natural causes, but Edmund had not died of a heart attack, natural or induced. He had been shot twice, which meant that someone had poisoned him or attempted to, and, when that failed or proved too slow, had resorted to more direct measures. Miss Marple received this information with the kind of calm that suggested she had anticipated something of the sort. She was, however, deeply interested in the question of who had access to Edmund's medications. Victoria would have had access, she reasoned aloud to Constable Webb. She lived in the same cottage. But so would anyone who visited the cottage. And Victoria is not, as far as I am aware, a woman of medical knowledge. Switching medications requires either knowledge or deliberate malice. One suspects the latter, but one wonders about the former. You think someone else tampered with the medications, and Victoria simply found him before she could report it? Webb asked hopefully. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we are beginning to understand why Victoria is protecting someone. If Edmund had been poisoned even unsuccessfully, then discovering that fact would require explaining how the poisoning occurred. Who had access? Who had knowledge? Who had motive? Over the following days, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries. She visited Dr. Pemberton and asked casually about which of his patients suffered from heart conditions. She spoke with the pharmacist about who might have knowledge of medication interactions. She even took a walk past Willow End, observing the cottage with the kind of attention she normally reserved for needlework patterns. It was during this walk that she noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention. A small gardening shed positioned away from the main cottage, with a lock that had been recently forced. Inside, disturbed but not extensively searched, were tools and supplies, and on a shelf, carefully positioned, were several bottles of various household remedies and medicinal preparations. One of these bottles was empty, though its label indicated it had contained a tincture of foxglove, substance known to affect the heart, dangerous in improper doses, and entirely uncontrolled in terms of who might purchase it. Miss Marple photographed the label mentally and withdrew, leaving everything as she found it. That evening, she requested a private meeting with Miss Herringsworth. The solicitor arrived at 7:30, just as the light was beginning to fade from the April sky. "I believe I have located something relevant," Miss Marple said without preamble. "A bottle in the shed at Willow End, labeled as foxglove tincture. The bottle is empty, but the label remains. Edmund died from gunshot wounds, yes, but it appears someone attempted to poison him first, using his own medications, supplemented with something more aggressive." Miss Herringsworth's face grew very still. "If Victoria purchased foxglove tincture, I am not suggesting Victoria purchased anything," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I am suggesting that someone with knowledge of poisoning attempted something that failed, and when it failed, someone with knowledge of firearms provided a more permanent solution. These two people may or may not be the same individual, but Victoria knows who they are, and she is protecting them. Why would she do that?" Miss Herringsworth asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "she loves them, or because she owes them something, or because the alternative exposing their guilt would cause her greater pain than her own imprisonment. There are many reasons a person will sacrifice themselves for another. The question is not why Victoria is protecting someone. The question is who and why that person required protection." Miss Herringsworth stood, her expression troubled but determined. "I need to speak with Victoria, directly, about whether she knows who poisoned Edmund's medications and why. And when you do," Miss Marple said, "I would suggest asking her not about Edmund's death, but about her relationship with the Northcutt family. I suspect that is where the answer lies." The solicitor departed into the gathering darkness, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. Outside, the village settled into evening, unaware that the architecture of the crime was beginning to reveal itself. The poisoning had failed, but it had not been random. The shooting had succeeded, but it was not the original plan. Someone in Thornfield had wanted Edmund Hartley dead, badly enough to try multiple methods, and someone else, someone Victoria loved enough to sacrifice her own. Freedom had been willing to help. The question now was whether the investigation would ever penetrate that protective wall of silence, or whether Victoria's sacrifice would stand as final. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The conversation between Miss Herringsworth and Victoria. Hartley was conducted in the county jail's visiting room, a bleak space of institutional grey that seemed designed to discourage hope. What transpired during that meeting remained, by necessity. Confidential solicitor-client privilege protected the exchange, but when Miss Herringsworth departed, her expression suggested that considerable ground had been covered. She came directly to Miss Marple's cottage, arriving just as the afternoon light was beginning its descent toward evening. "Victoria confirms your theory," Miss Herringsworth said, without preamble. "Someone attempted to poison Edmund using his medications. She discovered it by accident, found the empty foxglove bottle in the shed and realized what had been done. But she refused to report it because doing so would require identifying who had access to the cottage, who had knowledge of poisoning, and ultimately, who had motive. And who, Miss Marple asked quietly, had such access and knowledge? That, Miss Herringsworth said with evident frustration, is where Victoria becomes evasive. She will not name anyone. She will not confirm suspicions. She insists only that the person responsible acted from desperation rather than malice, and that exposing them would destroy an innocent life. There is no such person as innocent in this situation, Miss Marple observed. There is only degrees of culpability and understanding of circumstances. Victoria sees it differently, and her silence is remarkably effective without her testimony. I cannot prove who tampered with the medications. I can prove Edmund was poisoned, yes, but proving who administered the poison requires her cooperation or independent evidence. Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the village beyond. Thornfield looked peaceful in the late afternoon light, its cottages and gardens arranged in the appearance of perfect tranquility. But beneath that surface, secrets festered like infections. "There is another approach," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "We need not prove who poisoned Edmund. We need only understand the relationships and circumstances that made poisoning seem necessary. Once we understand the why, the who becomes inevitable. Then tell me," Miss Herringsworth said, "what have you observed about the relationships in this village?" Miss Marple turned from the window and began to speak, her words measured and careful. She described Edmund Hartley, a dying man who had chosen to leave London and come to a village where no one knew him. A man who had married a woman nearly 30 years his junior, despite his deteriorating health. A man whose arrival in Thornfield had coincided with observable tension in at least 2 households. James Northcott, Miss Marple continued, displayed unusual nervousness when questioned about his whereabouts on the morning Edmund died. Not the nervousness of guilt, but the nervousness of someone concealing knowledge. And his daughter, Elizabeth, has anyone questioned her? Miss Herringsworth checked her notes. Elizabeth Northcott was at the mill with her father, apparently. Their servants confirmed seeing both of them. But servants can be mistaken about timing, Miss Marple observed, or deliberately vague about it. Young Elizabeth is 24, unmarried, and has lived in her father's house for her entire life. Presumably, she was quite close to her mother before Catherine's death 7 years ago. Understanding began to dawn in Miss Herringsworth's expression. "You think Elizabeth poisoned Edmund? But what would be her motive?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we should investigate whether Elizabeth had any connection to Victoria before Victoria came to Thornfield, and whether James Northcott's nervousness might stem not from his own guilt, but from knowledge of his daughter's actions." The inquiry that followed was conducted discreetly but thoroughly. Miss Herringsworth hired a private investigator from the county. a capable woman named Mrs. Holloway who specialized in uncovering information that conventional investigation overlooked. Within 3 days, Mrs. Holloway reported back with discoveries that reframed the entire case. Elizabeth Northcott and Victoria Hartley had known each other before Victoria came to Thornfield. They had, in fact, been acquainted through mutual friends in London, where Elizabeth had spent 2 seasons attempting to find a suitable marriage. During one of these seasons, Elizabeth had met Edmund Hartley at a social gathering. She had, according to the investigators' sources, been quite taken with him, despite his obvious age and poor health. More than merely taken, Mrs. Holloway reported. According to her lady's maid, Elizabeth was profoundly attached to him. She spoke of him constantly, saved newspaper clippings mentioning his name, seemed to believe that if circumstances were different, something might develop between them. And then Edmund married Victoria, Miss Marple said softly. Precisely. Elizabeth's infatuation shifted to obsession. She returned to Thornfield and apparently spent months in a state of distress. When her father mentioned that Edmund and Victoria had taken Willow Ender property situated not far from the Northcott estate, distress apparently transformed into something more dangerous. The pieces began to align. Elizabeth, heartbroken and obsessed, learned that her childhood infatuation was living nearby. She had access to the Northcott lands, which bordered Ashford Woods. She likely had knowledge of poisoning. Her mother, Catherine, had been a botanist of some skill, and Elizabeth had inherited both her mother's botanical knowledge and her collection of medicinal preparations. Most importantly, Elizabeth had motive. She had watched the man she loved marry someone else, watched him die anyway, and been unable to accept that Victor, beautiful, young, and seemingly undeserving of Edmund's attention, would be the one to inherit his fortune. But there remains one crucial question, Miss Herringsworth said. How does Victoria fit into this? Why would she protect Elizabeth North? Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Because Victoria is not what she appears to be. Send Mrs. Holloway to investigate Victoria's background more thoroughly. I suspect you will find that her connection to the Northcott family runs deeper than a casual London acquaintance with Elizabeth. The investigation that followed revealed the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of careful deception. Victoria had not been married to Edmund Hartley for money or security. She had married him to protect Hermand ultimately, to protect his interests when death became inevitable. Victoria was, in fact, Edmund's natural daughter, born to his mistress decades earlier. She had been raised in obscurity and given a modest inheritance by her father through intermediaries. When Edmund fell ill, he had reached out to her through careful correspondence, asking her to come to him, asking her to be his daughter in name, if not in acknowledged fact. And when Elizabeth Northcott's obsession threatened to destroy Edmund through poisoning, Victoria had discovered it and, faced with an impossible choice, had decided to protect Elizabeth by accepting responsibility for the crime herself. She knew Elizabeth poisoned him, Miss Herringsworth explained to Miss Marple, her voice filled with the kind of sorrow that comes from understanding tragedy. And she knew that exposing the truth would destroy not only Elizabeth but James Northcott's reputation and standing in the village. So she allowed herself to be arrested, protected the Northcott family, and sacrificed her own freedom. Love, Miss Marple said quietly, is a more powerful motivator than justice. Victoria had just found her father. She could not bear to be the instrument of destroying another family, even at the cost of her own liberty. The question now became what to do with this knowledge. Miss Herringsworth faced a profound ethical dilemma. She could expose Elizabeth's guilt and free her innocent client, but only by destroying the Northcott family and revealing Edmund's illegitimate daughter to the village. Or she could work within the legal system to find another path. That night, Constable Webb appeared at Miss Marple's cottage with an expression of deep confusion. "Inspector Harrow wants to arrest Elizabeth Northcott," he said without preamble. "Evidence has come to light suggesting her involvement in the poisoning, but he's uncertain whether to charge her with murder or simply with administering poison. And Miss Herringsworth is insisting on a meeting with Inspector Harrow before any arrest is made. And you, Miss Marple observed gently, have come to ask what I think should happen." "I have come to ask what is right," Webb corrected, "because I'm no longer certain what justice means when multiple people are guilty of different crimes, and one innocent person has chosen to bear all of the guilt." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the constable with the kind of expression that suggested she had been expecting this question for some time. "Justice," she said slowly, "is not the same as truth, and neither is the same as righteousness. In this case, we have a dying man whose legitimate problems have been exacerbated by obsession and desperation. We have a young woman whose love became poison. We have another young woman who sacrificed herself to protect both of them. And we have a father who failed to see his daughter's suffering until it was too late. So what do you propose?" Webb asked. "I propose," Miss Marple said, "that we wait for Miss Herringsworth's meeting with Inspector Harrow, because I suspect the truth, when properly presented, may offer a path forward that neither condemns the innocent nor protects the guilty." Chapter 7. Another twist. The meeting between Miss Herringsworth, Inspector Harrow, and the county prosecutor took place in the village hall on a grey morning when rain threatened but had not yet arrived. Miss Marple was not present, though Constable Webb attended and later reported the proceedings to her with considerable detail. Miss Herringsworth presented evidence of Elizabeth Northcott's involvement in the poisoning. Webb explained, settling into his customary chair. She was remarkably thorough. Documents showing Elizabeth's purchase of foxglove tincture 6 months ago. Correspondence between Elizabeth and the apothecary that suggested her interest in toxic substances. Even testimony from servants about Elizabeth's emotional state when Victoria and Edmund arrived in Thornfield. "And how did Inspector Harrow respond?" Miss Marple asked, with considerable frustration. "He pointed out that poisoning alone would not have resulted in Edmund's death. The firearms were necessary for that. And he was correct. Elizabeth poisoned Edmund, yes, but she did not shoot him." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but her hands stilled on her knitting. "Then who did?" Webb was quiet for a long moment. "That is where matters became complicated." The prosecutor pointed out what we had all overlooked. Victoria Hartley had access to the cottage, access to Edmund's person, and access to firearms. Edmund kept a small handgun for personal protection. It was mentioned in the inventory of Willow End's contents. And when the authorities searched the cottage more thoroughly, following Miss Herringsworth's suggestions, they found evidence that Victoria had handled the weapon. "Powder residue?" Miss Marple asked carefully. "Yes, on her clothing, in the shed where the gun was kept. Conclusive evidence that she had fired it." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. "So the poisoning was Elizabeth's work, but the shooting was Victoria's. Which means Victoria did not simply accept arrest to protect Elizabeth. She accepted arrest because she was, in fact, guilty." "Exactly," Webb said, his voice heavy with the weight of this realization. But the prosecutor is now faced with a peculiar problem. Victoria admits to firing the fatal shots. She claims she discovered Edmund poisoned and shot him to end his suffering. She insists it was an act of mercy rather than murder. And Elizabeth Northcott, when confronted with evidence of her own involvement, has confessed to the poisoning and claims she intended only to accelerate his death, not to prevent it. So they are both guilty, Miss Marple observed, but of different crimes, with different motivations, and different degrees of culpability. The prosecutor doesn't know how to proceed. If he charges Victoria with murder, she will claim mercy killing and point to the poisoning as evidence that Edmund was already dying. If he charges Elizabeth, she will claim she was attempting the same mercy killing through slower means. And both will insist they acted from love. Elizabeth for her obsession with Edmund, Victoria for her paternal connection to him. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "There is something you are not telling me, Constable Webb. Something that occurred during that meeting that has troubled you deeply." Webb shifted uncomfortably. Inspector Harrow discovered something else. Something that changes the nature of the entire crime. Edmund's London physician was contacted again, this time by the prosecutor's office, and he provided information that no one anticipated, which was, Edmund was not simply ill, Miss Marple. He was dying far more rapidly than anyone understood. The doctor says that Edmund had perhaps 6 weeks remaining, that 2 years Victoria had indicated. The poisoning would not have accelerated his death significantly. The illness itself was already doing that. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the kind of careful attention she normally reserved for observing human behavior. So Victoria's claim of mercy killing becomes more credible, and Elizabeth's poisoning becomes less immediately relevant to the actual cause of death. More than that, Webb continued, the prosecutor has begun to question whether the poisoning actually contributed to Edmund's death at all. The autopsy showed no trace of foxglove in Edmund's system. The poisoned medications were never actually consumed. Edmund apparently noticed the taste was off and stopped taking them after the first dose, which means Elizabeth's attempted poisoning failed entirely, and Edmund died purely from the gunshot wounds. Which means, Miss Marple said slowly, that Elizabeth did not actually kill Edmund. She attempted to kill him, failed, and then Victoria succeeded using firearms. So Elizabeth is guilty of attempted murder, while Victoria is guilty of murder, and yet both claim they acted from love. Yes, Webb said miserably. And now there is another complication. There always is, Miss Marple murmured. Elizabeth has attempted to take full responsibility for the poisoning and the shooting. She claims she fired the gun as well, that Victoria was protecting her by accepting arrest initially. She says Victoria discovered her guilt, and rather than expose her, accepted the blame herself. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, which is almost certainly untrue. Almost certainly. But Elizabeth is adamant. She has provided details about the shooting that she could not possibly know unless she had researched them extensively after the fact. And her father, James Northcott, has hired the finest legal representation available to protect her. Understanding bloomed in Miss Marple's expression. James Northcott is not protecting his daughter because he believes her innocent. He is protecting her because he knows she attempted poison and is now willing to accept blame for murder to spare her from prosecution, which creates a situation where we have 3 guilty parties. Elizabeth and James is willing to accept blame in different measures, none of them willing to expose the others. And the prosecutor cannot determine who actually fired the fatal shots because the evidence is ambiguous. The witnesses are silent, and the guilty parties are colluding to protect each other. Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the rain that had finally begun to fall. The village beyond was grey and indistinct, its inhabitants moving through their daily routines, unaware of the complexity that lay beneath surface appearances. "What does Victoria say about Elizabeth's new confession?" Miss Marple asked. "She says nothing. She refuses to comment. She simply maintains that she shot Edmund, and that her motivation was mercy." "And what does the prosecutor intend to do?" "He is currently in a state of paralysis," Webb admitted. "He can prosecute Victoria for murder, and she will almost certainly hang. He can prosecute Elizabeth for attempted murder, and her father's lawyers will argue that the attempted poisoning failed and therefore caused no harm. He can prosecute James Northcote for obstruction of justice, but proving his knowledge of the poisoning is difficult when Elizabeth refuses to implicate him. Or he can accept that this crime is too tangled with competing guilt and competing love to prosecute cleanly." Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The needles resumed their clicking, a steady rhythm that suggested deep thought. "There is one more thing," Webb said quietly. "James Northcote came to see me yesterday. Off the record, he said that if the prosecutor pushes for trial, he will ensure that Victoria's true parentage becomes public knowledge. He will expose her as Edmund's illegitimate daughter and suggest that the entire marriage was a fraud conducted for inheritance purposes. He said this would destroy her reputation and ensure any jury would view her with suspicion and disdain." "He is playing a dangerous game," Miss Marple observed, "threatening to expose the truth while his own daughter's guilt hangs in the balance." "Yes, and he's making it clear that he is willing to destroy Victoria, entirely if it means protecting Elizabeth." Miss Marple knitted in silence for several moments. "There is a lesson in all of this, Constable Webb. It is the same lesson that small villagers teach repeatedly to those patient enough to observe, that the crimes we commit are rarely solitary. They ripple outward, creating secondary crimes, secondary guilt, secondary loves and loyalties that become impossible to untangle." "So what should I do?" Webb asked desperately. "You should do nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "This matter has moved beyond constable work and village knowledge. But I would suggest that you speak with Miss Herringsworth. Tell her what James Northcote has threatened, because blackmail, you see, is its own crime, and it may be the thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire knot." Webb departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and the steady sound of rain against the windows. Outside, the village continued in ignorance. But within the walls of the prosecutor's office, the machinery of justice ground slowly forward, attempting to process crimes that could not be cleanly separated from the love and desperation that had motivated them. And in the county jail, Victoria Hartley sat in her cell, protecting secrets that were not entirely her own, sacrificing herself for a family she had known for mere months, bearing the weight of a crime she had committed for reasons that transcended simple guilt or innocence. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test, the revelation of James. Northcote's blackmail threat transformed the case entirely. What had been a tangled knot of competing guilts suddenly became a matter of clear criminal intent. Miss Herringsworth, armed with Webb's information, brought the matter directly to the prosecutor, who recognized immediately that James Northcote's threats constituted obstruction of justice and coercion within 48 hours. James Northcote found himself facing his own legal jeopardy, the comfortable certainty that had carried him through years of business dealings, the assumption that wealth and position, could insulate him from consequence began to crumble under the weight of his own desperation. It was at this precise moment that Miss Marple decided to take direct action. She requested a meeting with James Northcote, a request that surprised him sufficiently that he agreed, perhaps believing that the elderly village woman might somehow offer him a path out of his predicament. He arrived at her cottage on a Thursday afternoon, bringing with him the agitation of a man whose world was collapsing. Mr. Northcote, Miss Marple greeted him at her door. "How kind of you to visit. Do come in. I have just made tea." The cottage was warm and orderly, filled with the kind of domestic comfort that James Northcote's own house, despite its greater size and wealth, had never quite achieved. He settled into the chair across from Miss Marple, his fingers tapping against the armrest in that same peculiar rhythm that Constable Webb had observed weeks earlier, always counting, as though numbers might somehow provide the order that his life had lost. "I know why you've come," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with steady hands. "You're wondering whether I might intercede on your behalf, whether my influence in the village might somehow mitigate the prosecutor's determination to pursue charges against you." "The thought had occurred to me," James said, his voice tight. "I have been a respected member of this community for decades. Surely that counts for something." "It does," Miss Marple agreed, "though I wonder whether you understand precisely what counts against you. It is not, I think, your blackmail or your obstruction. Those are merely legal formalities. What truly weighs against you is something far more fundamental, which is the fact that you discovered your daughter's guilt and chose to protect it rather than to address it. You chose love, or your version of it, over responsibility, and in doing so, you set in motion a chain of events that has resulted in an innocent woman potentially facing execution for a crime that, while she committed it, was motivated by mercy rather than malice." James Northcote's face flushed. "Victoria Hartley is not innocent. She murdered Edmund Hartley." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed calmly. "She did. But she murdered him because he was already dying, already poisoned by your daughter's obsessive love, and already suffering beyond the point where suffering serves any purpose. Your daughter attempted to accomplish what Victoria ultimately accomplished, but through slower means. When Elizabeth's poisoning failed, Victoria completed the task with mercy as her motivation." "That is not murder," James said fiercely. "That is mercy-killing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "A crime in the eyes of the law, certainly, but a different species of crime than what your daughter committed. Elizabeth poisoned Edmund from obsession, from the delusional belief that his death would somehow return her to the state she occupied before his marriage. Victoria shot him because she recognized that further suffering served no purpose." James was silent, his fingers still tapping that rhythmic counting against the chair's arm. "I have spent my entire life observing human nature," Miss Marple continued, "and I have learned that the most destructive love is the kind that mistakes possession for care. Your daughter loved Edmund Hartley, yes, but she loved him as one might love a possession that has been taken by another. She did not love him as a person. She loved what he represented, you, vitality, a future that could never actually exist between them." "You cannot possibly understand," James began. "I understand perfectly," Miss Marple said, and her voice carried the weight of decades spent watching human nature unfold in small villages. "I have seen it countless times. A young woman becomes attached to an older man. She mistakes infatuation for love. When the older man marries someone more appropriate, the young woman cannot accept the natural order of things. Instead, she constructs elaborate fantasies where her love is thwarted by circumstance rather than reality. She paused to take a sip of tea. "What I am curious about, Mr. Northcott, is what you believed would happen if you protected Elizabeth from prosecution. Did you imagine she would recover from this obsession? That Lovereal Love would eventually find her with someone appropriate to her age and station?" "I believed she would have the opportunity to live," James said quietly. "To move forward. To not have her entire future destroyed by a moment of madness." "But that is precisely what has happened," Miss Marple observed. "By protecting her, you have ensured that her obsession with Edmund Hartley will define her entire life. She will be known in this village and, far beyond, as the woman who poisoned her father's friend. That knowledge will follow her forever. She will be unable to marry, unable to form genuine attachments, unable to escape the shadow of what she did." James Northcott's face crumpled. "What would you have me do?" "I would have you recognize," Miss Marple said gently, "that true love sometimes requires allowing the person we love to face the consequences of their actions. Elizabeth poisoned Edmund Hartley. That is a fact that no amount of legal maneuvering can change. But she did not kill him. Victoria did. And Victoria's crime was motivated by mercy, while your daughter's was motivated by obsession. The prosecutor will hang her," James whispered. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps, if the full truth were presented, if Elizabeth recanted her false confession, if you ceased your obstruction, if the circumstances of Edmund's declining health and the nature of Victoria's motivation were laid bare, perhaps the law might recognize that Victoria's act, while technically murder, was mercy rather than malice. But that would expose Elizabeth." "Yes," Miss Marple interrupted. "It would. And that is the price of true love, Mr. Northcott. Not protection from consequence, but acceptance that our children are capable of error and must sometimes face those errors. Elizabeth attempted to poison Edmund Hartley. Let her face trial for that attempt. Let her accept responsibility for her actions, and perhaps, in doing so, she might develop the capacity for genuine love that she currently lacks." James Northcott sat in silence for a long time, his fingers still against the armrest now. The counting halted. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "If I withdraw my threats, if I allow Elizabeth to be prosecuted for the poisoning, if I cease my obstruction of the investigation, will that be enough to save Victoria Hartley from execution?" "It may be," Miss Marple said. "The prosecutor, armed with the full truth, may recognize that Victoria's act was motivated by mercy rather than malice. The courts may view her more sympathetically. But more importantly, Mr. North, you will have given your daughter the opportunity to develop genuine character rather than merely inherited privilege." James Northcott left Miss Marple's cottage as evening fell, moving like a man who had aged considerably in the space of an afternoon. By the following morning, his solicitors had withdrawn their threats. By noon, Elizabeth Northcott had recanted her false confession and admitted to the poisoning, admitting simultaneously that she had not fired the fatal shots, and by evening, the path had been cleared for Victoria Hartley's trial to proceed on entirely different grounds than had been anticipated. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden as darkness fell, reflected on the nature of intervention in human affairs. She had not solved the crime had solved itself through the weight of guilt and the pressure of competing loyalties. She had simply helped one person understand that protecting someone from consequence was sometimes the cruelest form of love. The rain had stopped. Stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. And somewhere in the county jail, Victoria Hartley prepared herself for a trial that would determine not whether she had committed murder, but whether mercy could find shelter within the rigid structure of the law. Chapter 9. The trial of Victoria Hartley took place on a cold morning in May. In the county courthouse, where cases of significance were heard and verdicts rendered that would echo through the lives of those involved. Miss Marple attended, though she sat in the public gallery rather than in any official capacity, her presence noted by few and understood by fewer still. The prosecutor presented his case methodically. He established that Victoria Hartley had fired 2 shots that killed Edmund Hartley on the morning of April 12th. He presented the powder residue evidence, the ballistics, the testimony of Dr. Pemberton regarding the nature of the wounds. He built a case for premeditated murder, suggesting that Victoria had married Edmund for his fortune and, impatient with his slow decline, had accelerated his death. But then Miss Harringsworth took her turn, and the nature of the trial transformed entirely. She presented Edmund's medical history, the rapid deterioration that the London physician testified had been occurring far faster than anyone in Thornfield realized. She presented evidence of Elizabeth Northcote's attempted poisoning, establishing that Victoria had discovered her father's would-be killer and had been forced to choose between exposing that guilt or protecting it. My client, Miss Harringsworth, told the jury, her voice carrying the weight of careful argument, discovered that her father was being poisoned by a woman consumed by obsessive delusion. She faced an impossible choice: expose the poisoning and destroy a family, or address the fundamental problem herself. Edmund Hartley was dying. The poisoning would not have significantly altered the timeline of his death, but it represented a prolonged suffering inflicted by someone claiming to love him. She presented the testimony of Dr. Pemberton regarding the psychological state of a dying patient. She presented character witnesses who attested to Victoria's care for Edmund during his final months. And she presented the most crucial piece of evidence: Edmund's own letters to Victoria, written before his death, in which he explicitly discussed his desire for an end to his suffering and his trust in Victoria to make difficult decisions on his behalf. These letters, Miss Harringsworth said, holding them up for the jury to see, constitute a form of consent. Not legal consent, certainly, but moral consent. Edmund Hartley understood he was dying. He understood his daughter. His daughter, whom he had only recently found, was capable of difficult decisions. And he wrote these letters with the clear understanding that Victoria might be forced to make a choice that the law would condemn, but that his conscience would absolve. The courtroom was utterly silent as Miss Harringsworth read passages from the letters. Edmund's handwriting had been shaky, the product of a man writing while in significant pain, but the message was unmistakable. He had been preparing Victoria for the possibility that she might need to act as his agent in ending his suffering. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, arguing that no letter could justify murder. The judge sustained some objections and overruled others, but the damage, or perhaps the healing, depending on one's perspective, had been done. The jury had heard Edmund's own words regarding his state of mind and his wishes. Then came the final testimony, the piece that Miss Marple had orchestrated with careful precision. James Northcote took the stand, looking like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case, but necessary for the truth to emerge. He described discovering Elizabeth's obsessive letters regarding Edmund. He described finding the foxglove tincture and confronting his daughter about it. He described Elizabeth's confession that she had poisoned Edmund's medications. motivated by a delusional belief that Edmund's death would somehow allow her to return to her former emotional state. "I protected her," James said, his voice barely audible. "I threatened to expose Victoria's parentage, to discredit her testimony. I used my position and my wealth to obstruct the investigation. And I did this not because I believed her innocent, but because I could not bear the thought of my daughter facing the consequences of her actions." The prosecutor attempted to use this testimony to paint James as a man willing to destroy an innocent woman to protect his guilty daughter. But Miss Herringsworth reframed it entirely. "Mr. Northcote's actions," she told the jury, "represent the universal human desire to protect those we love from the consequences of their mistakes. But they also represent something more important, a man's eventual recognition that such protection is a form of cruelty." James Northcote came to understand that Victoria Hartley deserved to be heard, and that the truth, however complicated, was more important than his daughter's comfort. The closing arguments consumed an entire day. The prosecutor maintained that murder was murder, that circumstances could not justify the taking of a life, that the law existed precisely to prevent individuals from making unilateral decisions about life and death. But Miss Herringsworth argued something more subtle and more human. She argued that the law must sometimes recognize the distinction between murder and mercy, between premeditation born of greed and premeditation born of compassion. She argued that Victoria Hartley had not killed Edmund Hartley. Edmund Hartley, through his letters and his wishes, had asked Victoria to make a choice, and she had made it with love rather than malice. The law, Miss Herringsworth concluded, exists to punish crime, but my client's act, while technically criminal, was motivated by mercy and consent. I ask you to recognize that distinction. I ask you to find my client not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of assisting in the death of a person at their own request. A charge that carries a sentence far more merciful than hanging. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was compromise rather than clarity. They found Victoria guilty of assisting in the death of a person at their own request, a charge that technically existed but was rarely prosecuted with severity. The judge, sentencing Victoria to 5 years in prison with possibility of parole after 3, seemed to recognize the careful balance that had been struck. Victoria would not hang, but neither would she walk free. The law had been satisfied and mercy had been acknowledged. As Victoria was led from the courtroom, she looked directly at Miss Marple, and for just a moment, her expression was not the calculated composure of before, but genuine gratitude. She had been protected, not by lies, but by the truth carefully presented. She had been condemned, not by malice, but by love that had finally been allowed to speak for itself. Miss Marple rose and walked from the courtroom as the afternoon light streamed through the high windows. Outside, the village of Thornfield awaited, ready to digest this verdict and incorporate it into its ongoing narrative of events. But Miss Marple did not return to Thornfield immediately. Instead, she walked through the county town, observing the ordinary people going about their ordinary business, each one carrying secrets and burdens that no one else would ever fully understand. She thought about Victoria, sitting in a cell, having sacrificed years of her life. She thought about Elizabeth Northcote, facing trial for attempted murder. She thought about James Northcote, learning that love sometimes requires allowing the beloved to face consequences. And she thought about Edmund Hartley, who had orchestrated his own mercy from beyond the grave through carefully crafted letters, through the choice of a daughter he had only just discovered, through the complex interweaving of love and duty and the recognition that sometimes the kindest act is to let go. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely simple, but it was more merciful than the comfortable lies that people constructed to avoid confronting human complexity. Chapter 10. After Matsima came to Thornfield, with the kind of gentle persistence that small villages experience, when scandal has run its course and daily life must reassert itself. The roses bloomed in Miss Marple's garden, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded around them. The village shops reopened to their usual rhythms. The church held its Sunday services with the same familiar liturgy, though the congregation had been rearranged by guilt and revelation in ways that would take years to fully resolve. Elizabeth Northcote's trial resulted in a conviction for attempted murder, with sentencing that reflected the failure of her poisoning rather than its intention. She received 7 years to be served in a women's facility some distance from Thornfield. James Northcote, charged with obstruction of justice and coercion, received a suspended sentence conditional on his cooperation with the authorities and his commitment to seeking professional guidance for his relationship with his daughter. The village's reaction to these verdicts was complicated and contradictory. Some felt that justice had been served. Others believed the punishments insufficient. A third contingent, led primarily by the younger inhabitants, seemed to have developed a kind of romantic sympathy for Victoria's sacrifice, transforming her from widow to martyr in the collective imagination. Miss Marple found the villagers' reinvention of events both fascinating and troubling. She had observed this phenomenon many times before, the human tendency to reshape truth into narrative, to smooth the complicated edges of reality into something more aesthetically pleasing. It was on a warm afternoon in late June that Constable Webb came to visit with news that required Miss Marple's immediate attention. "Victoria Hartley has been granted early parole," he announced. settling into the familiar chair. On account of good behavior and the unusual circumstances of her case, the parole board apparently agreed with Miss Herringsworth's argument that the nature of her crime was fundamentally different from conventional murder. When will she be released? Miss Marple asked, though she had already anticipated this development. 3 weeks. She'll be discharged with the requirement that she remain under parole supervision for the remainder of her sentence. She cannot leave the county without permission, and she must report monthly to the parole officer. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And what will she do when she is released? Where will she go? That is precisely why I've come, Webb said. She's written to you, requested a meeting. She wants to discuss her future, and apparently she believes you might have insight into what that should be. The letter arrived the following day, forwarded through the prison authorities and bearing the institutional stamps of official correspondence. Victoria's handwriting was controlled and precise, even after months of imprisonment. Dear Miss Marple, I am to be released in 3 weeks. I find myself facing a future without Edmund and without the role that his presence defined. I have nowhere to go and no one to whom I owe obligation. And yet I find myself thinking of Thornfield, not with dread of judgment, but with a sense of incompleteness. I wonder whether you might be willing to meet with me. I have much I wish to understand about the events that have brought me to this point, and I suspect you have insights that others do not possess. Your servant, Victoria Hartley. Miss Marple replied with an invitation to tea on the day following Victoria's release. When that day arrived, she prepared her garden with particular care, arranging chairs in the shade of the apple tree and ensuring that the tea service was set with the kind of attention that suggested this was not a casual conversation. Victoria arrived at 3:30, walking up the garden path with the careful movements of someone who had spent months in confinement and was still relearning the rhythms of freedom. She was thinner than Miss Marple remembered, with a quality of translucence that suggested her time in prison had burned away everything except the most essential elements of self. You kept your promise, Miss Marple said, gesturing toward a chair. You said in your letter from prison that you were protecting someone. And you did, for as long as you could. I protected James Northcote and his daughter, Victoria replied, settling into the offered seat. And I protected my father's memory by ensuring that the village would not learn he had fathered a child outside of marriage. Though I confess I no longer understand whether that protection was merciful or merely foolish. Both, Miss Marple said, pouring tea. Protection generally is. The question is whether the protection serves those being protected or merely serves our own need to avoid difficult truths. Victoria accepted the tea and held it without drinking, as though the warmth of the cup was sufficient comfort. Edmund wrote those letters for me, didn't he? He anticipated that I might need to make a decision about his death. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. Your father was a thoughtful man and a dying man. He had time to consider what he wished to leave behind. He left you a choice and the documentation of that choice. It was a gift disguised as burden. It feels more like burden, Victoria said quietly. 3 years in prison, branded forever as a woman who killed her husband. The village will never see me as anything else. The village, Miss Marple observed, will see you precisely as you allow yourself to be seen. You have spent months in hiding, first through marriage to Edmund, then through arrest and imprisonment. Perhaps the time has come to stop hiding and to be seen as you actually are. Victoria looked at her with sudden understanding. You believe I should remain in Thornfield? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that running away would be easier but less honest. Thornfield knows what you have done. It has had months to process that knowledge and incorporate it into its understanding of who you are. To leave would suggest that you cannot accept that understanding. To remain would suggest that you can. People will hate me, Victoria said. Some will, Miss Marple agreed. Others will pity you. A few, if you are fortunate, will understand. That is the nature of returning to a community that has witnessed your darkest moment. But Thornfield also contains people who recognize that your crime was motivated by love rather than malice. People like Constable Webb, like Miss Herringsworth, like myself. We are not numerous, but we exist. They sat in silence for a time, drinking tea and watching the garden. The roses had reached their peak, the color so vivid it seemed almost painful. Bees moved among the flowers with purposeful dedication, gathering nectar with no awareness of the human dramas surrounding them. Edmund left me his property, Victoria said eventually. Willow End, the cottage where he died. The solicitor has been managing it during my imprisonment. I could sell it and go elsewhere, begin again somewhere my past is unknown. You could, Miss Marple agreed. But you won't. Victoria turned to look at her, and a faint smile touched her lips. How can you be so certain? Because you came here looking for permission to stay, Miss Marple said gently. You came to an old woman who you believed would understand that remaining is possible. And I am telling you that it is. Remain in Thornfield. Restore Willow End. Build a life that honors Edmund's memory through your presence rather than through your absence. Show the village that a person can commit a difficult act and still possess value and integrity. What should I do with my days? Victoria asked. How should I occupy myself? Miss Marple considered this. I suspect you have considerable knowledge of gardens and growing things. Edmund's mother was a botanist, and he inherited both her love of plants and her library of botanical texts. Willow End has excellent soil and access to light. A woman with knowledge and dedication could create something quite remarkable there. You're suggesting I become a gardener. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, that you become whatever allows you to live authentically. If that is gardening, then garden. If that is writing, then write. If that is teaching others what you have learned through your time in prison, then teach. But do it in Thornfield, where you can be held accountable for your actions and where your presence can remind people that redemption is possible. Victoria set down her teacup and rose, walking to the edge of the garden where it overlooked the village beyond. Thornfield spread below them in its peaceful arrangement of cottages and gardens and winding roads. The village will talk about me constantly, Victoria said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. They will. That is the price of being known rather than unknown. But talk, while uncomfortable, is not judgment. Talk is merely the way small communities process information. Eventually, the novelty of your story will fade, and you will become simply another resident of As the afternoon light lengthened toward evening, Victoria prepared to leave. But before she departed, Miss Marple pressed a small package into her hands. Seeds, Miss Marple explained. From my own garden. They are roses that require patience and care but produce exceptional blooms. I thought they might be appropriate for Willow End. Victoria accepted the package with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said simply. You are welcome, Miss Marple replied, though I suspect the thanks should flow in the other direction. You have reminded me why I have spent so many years observing human nature. It is not because I seek judgment or certainty. It is because human beings are endlessly capable of surprising themselves and each other with their capacity for growth and redemption. She watched as Victoria walked down the garden path and disappeared toward the village beyond, and she sat alone beneath the apple tree, knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, reflecting on the nature of justice and mercy and the possibility that sometimes they could exist in the same moment, held together by the complicated bonds of love and sacrifice and human understanding. Thornfield would continue to talk about Victoria Hartley, but the conversation, Miss Marple suspected, would gradually transform from scandal to sympathy, from judgment to recognition, from the young widow to beautiful to be innocent to simply Victoria, a woman who had loved her father enough to bear the weight of his freedom, and that, Miss Marple thought, was as close to justice as the human world could manage. Chapter 11. Reflection and Resolution. Autumn arrived in Thornfield with the kind of gentle melancholy that comes when summer has exhausted itself and the village prepares for the slower, quieter months ahead. The leaves turned gold and crimson, falling in patterns that suggested order even in dissolution, and Victoria Hartley, having spent 3 months rebuilding her life at Willow End, had begun to establish herself as something other than a scandal. The transformation had not been swift, or without resistance. When Victoria first appeared at the village market in July, several women had pointedly turned away. The vicar's wife, Dorothy Chen, had initially avoided greeting her. Mrs. Hartwell had made remarks sufficiently cutting to draw blood. Had anyone been listening closely enough? But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere had shifted. It began with small gestures. Old Mrs. Patterson, who owned the tea room, had offered Victoria a position as an assistant gardener to maintain the establishment's flowers. Victoria, recognizing the olive branch for what it was, had accepted. She had transformed the tea room's garden from a tangle of neglected blooms into something approaching beauty. Then came the Autumn Flower Show, an annual event where Thornfield's residents displayed their horticultural efforts. Victoria had submitted entries roses from Miss Marple's seeds, now blooming with extraordinary vitality. The judges, faced with undeniable quality, had awarded them first prize. No one could have prevented it without making their prejudice explicitly visible. Miss Marple attended the flower show on a cool September afternoon, observing the results with the kind of attention she normally reserved for human behavior. The roses were indeed spectacular, their blooms so perfect they seemed almost artificial. But what interested Miss Marple more was the way the village had begun to regard Victoria. Young Michael Ashford stood near her display, looking at the flowers with an expression that suggested his infatuation had matured into something more genuine, recognition of Victoria as a person rather than as an object of desire. He was speaking with her about gardening techniques, and his conversation was informed and respectful rather than besotted. Elizabeth Northcote's absence from the event was notable, though hardly surprising given her current circumstances. But James Northcote had come, and when he saw Victoria's display, he had approached her directly. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, but Miss Marple observed a handshake that concluded it not the perfunctory gesture of obligation, but something approaching genuine reconciliation. "The roses are extraordinary," Miss Marple said, joining Victoria after James had departed. "You have clearly inherited your father's botanical sensibilities. Edmund left me his entire collection of botanical texts," Victoria replied. "I have been studying them obsessively. It turns out that gardening requires both passion and precision, rather like solving mysteries, I imagine." Indeed, Miss Marple said. Both require observation and patience. Both require allowing patterns to emerge rather than forcing them into predetermined shapes. They walked through the flower show together, and Miss Marple noted how many people now greeted Victoria. How many acknowledged her presence without the visible discomfort that had characterized earlier encounters. The village had not forgiven. Her forgiveness was perhaps too strong a word, but it had begun to accommodate her, to make space for her within its social structure. Constable Webb told me something interesting, Victoria said, as they examined a display of dahlias. He said that Inspector Harrow was transferred to another county. Apparently there were questions raised about the thoroughness of his initial investigation. He had been so certain of my guilt that he overlooked essential evidence for nearly a week. Inspector Harrow is a capable man, Miss Marple said diplomatically, but he shares a common failing. He believed what he expected to believe. Once he had constructed his narrative, he sought only information that would support it. That is how most mistakes in investigation occur, not through lack of effort, but through premature certainty. They continued their walk in companionable silence. At the edge of the show, they encountered Clara Winters, Margaret Ashford's niece, who had proven herself remarkably complex beneath her sharp exterior. Mrs. Hartley, Clara greeted her with genuine warmth. I wanted to tell you that I've been asked to write an article about the flower show for the county newspaper. I would very much like to feature your roses. With your permission, of course. Victoria seemed surprised by this gesture. I would be honored, though I confess I am surprised by your interest. You were not particularly sympathetic toward me in the early days of the investigation. No, Clara agreed, her expression becoming more serious. I was not, but I have learned something from observing how this matter resolved. I learned that judgment is easy, but understanding is difficult. And I learned that journalists saw would be journalists have a responsibility to seek understanding rather than to confirm existing prejudices. Your story deserves to be told accurately, not as scandal, but as it actually occurred. After Clara departed, Victoria turned to Miss Marple with an expression of bewilderment. Why are people being kind to me now? What has changed? Nothing has changed, Miss Marple said. The facts of your actions remain identical, but the context in which those facts are understood has shifted. The village now knows why you did what you did. It knows about Edmund's letters, about your motivation, about the complexity that surrounds every human action. But I still killed him, Victoria said quietly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. You did. And that fact will never change. But the village has come to understand that killing and murder are not identical. That context matters. That love, even when it results in actions the law condemns, is still love. They left the flower show as afternoon light began its descent toward evening. The autumn air carried the first hints of winter, a reminder that seasons turned and nothing remained static. As they walked through the village streets, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case that had consumed the summer. It had been, in many ways, a simple mystery. A man had been shot. A woman had been arrested. Investigation had revealed layers of complexity beneath the initial appearance. But what had truly interested Miss Marple was not the mechanics of the crime, but the way human beings navigated guilt, love, sacrifice, and redemption. Victoria Hartley had come to Thornfield as a stranger, married a dying man, and through that marriage had discovered a family she had never known. She had then sacrificed her freedom to protect that family's secrets. And she had done this not because she was naive, or because she did not understand the consequences, but because she had recognized that some forms of love require such sacrifice. "I have been thinking," Victoria said as they reached the edge of the village, "about what I will do with the rest of my life. Willow End requires significance." She had spent nearly 7 decades observing human nature in all its complexity. She had learned that people were rarely entirely good or entirely evil. They were instead collections of contradictions and impulses, struggling to navigate a world that demanded certainty while offering only ambiguity. Victoria Hartley would never be entirely innocent in Thornfield's eyes, nor should she be. She had committed a crime, and that crime would remain with her always. But she was also a woman capable of sacrifice, of love, of restoration. She was complicated and human, which meant she was capable of both condemnation and redemption simultaneously, as Miss Marple reached her cottage and settled into her garden with her knitting. She found herself thinking about the title that had attached itself to Victoria early in the investigation: "The Young Widow Too Beautiful to Be Innocent." The village had believed that beauty and guilt were connected, that Victoria's attractiveness made her suspicion. But beauty, Miss Marple had learned, was merely one attribute among many. What mattered far more was the capacity to act with integrity, to face consequences, and to continue living with grace even after the world had judged you guilty. The evening settled around her, cool and peaceful. The needles clicked their familiar rhythm, and Miss Marple knitted as she had knitted through decades of mysteries, reflecting on the eternal complexity of human nature and the possibility, always present, always fragile, that understanding might triumph over judgment, and that redemption might somehow find its way even into the darkest corners of human action. Thornfield continued its ancient rhythms beneath the darkening sky, a village no longer defined by scandal, but by the possibility that its inhabitants might grow, might change, might eventually recognize each other's humanity, despite or perhaps because of their complicated pasts. Chapter 12. The Garden in Winter. Winter came to Thornfield with unusual severity, bringing snow in December that persisted through January and into February. The village transformed into something from a holiday remembrance, picturesque and peaceful, though with an undercurrent of isolation that winter always brought to small communities cut off by weather and darkness. Miss Marple observed the season from her cottage, where fires burned steadily and knitting projects multiplied with the long evenings. She had completed 3 cardigans and was working on a 4th when the letter arrived. Forwarded from the parole office in the county town, it was from Victoria, written in the careful script that had become increasingly confident over the months of her freedom. "Dear Miss Marple, I am writing to inform you that my application for permanent parole has been approved. I am no longer bound by the restrictions that have governed my movements for the past year. I am legally and officially a free woman. I wanted you to know because you were instrumental in helping me understand that freedom and innocence are not the same thing. I am not innocent, I never will be. But I am free in ways that extend far beyond legal documentation. Willow End has been extensively restored. The gardens are prepared for spring planting. I have submitted my proposal for the school to the local education board, and they have expressed interest in supporting it. Edmund's vision may yet become reality, but more importantly, I wished to thank you for seeing me as a person rather than as a scandal. In a village where I had every reason to expect judgment, you offered understanding. That understanding has transformed not only my life, but the way the village itself has begun to see me. I hope you will visit Willow End when spring arrives. I have planted the roses you gave me in a special location, and I would like you to see them bloom, your grateful friend. Victoria Hartley, Miss Marple read the letter twice, then set it carefully on her mantelpiece beside a small watercolor painting of the village that had been sent by Dorothy Chen, the vicar's wife who had initially joined in the village's judgment of Victoria. The painting included Willow End, and Victoria was depicted standing in the garden, her figure rendered with surprising gentleness for someone who had initially been so eager to condemn her. Spring came gradually to Thornfield, tentative and uncertain at first, then with increasing confidence. The snow melted into brown streams that ran through the village streets. The first brave flowers pushed through the thawing earth crocuses and snowdrops that had survived the winter's severity. It was on a particularly fine day in late April, nearly a year after Edmund's death, that Miss Marple finally visited Willow End. She had been invited to the formal opening of Victoria's garden school, an event that had become unexpectedly significant in the village's social calendar. The cottage, when she arrived, was almost unrecognizable from the isolated structure it had been when Edmund lived there. Victoria had opened the grounds, creating pathways and designated garden areas for instruction. Several villagers were already present, examining raised beds and listening to Victoria explain the principles of spring planting. Michael Ashford was there, no longer looking besotted, but engaged in genuine conversation about soil composition. Clara Winters had come with her camera, documenting the school's opening for the newspaper article she was writing. Even Mrs. Hartwell, the village's most dedicated gossip, had arrived with an expression of curious interest rather than condemnation. But what drew Miss Marple's immediate attention was the rose garden, situated in the sheltered southern aspect of the property. The roses she had given Victoria the previous summer were in spectacular bloom, dozens of them, their petals the deep crimson of blood and wine, their fragrance so rich it seemed almost edible. They responded well to the winter, Victoria explained, guiding Miss Marple to the rose garden with obvious pride. I was concerned that the severe frost might damage them, but they emerged stronger for having weathered hardship. Rather like people, I imagine. Rather like people, Miss Marple agreed. She stood among the roses, breathing in their fragrance, observing the careful way Victoria had arranged them. Not in formal rows, but in patterns that suggested both intention and natural growth. They looked, she thought, like redemption made visible. I wanted to tell you something, Victoria said, her voice becoming more serious. The parole board's decision to grant me permanent parole was not unanimous. One member argued that I should serve my full sentence, that mercy was insufficient punishment for taking a life. I thought about that argument quite a bit. What did you conclude? Miss Marple asked. I concluded that punishment and redemption are not the same thing. That serving a sentence does not necessarily produce change, while freedom does not necessarily prevent change. I served my time in prison and emerged determined to rebuild my life in a way that honored Edmund's memory and acknowledged the complexity of what I had done. That seems to me a more meaningful form of justice than additional years of confinement. They walked through the gardens together, Victoria pointing out the carefully planned layouts, the rotation systems she had designed, the spaces reserved for different seasonal plantings. It was clear that she had approached gardening with the same precision and passion that Miss Marple had observed in her, approach to everything thoughtful, intentional. I have been thinking about what you said, Victoria continued, about the village seeing me as I allow myself to be seen. I realized that for years I had presented myself as what others expected first, as a young woman seeking security, then as a widow seeking sympathy. But I never presented myself as simply Victoria. So I have been attempting to do that. To allow people to see me as a woman who gardens, who teaches, who made a terrible choice for understandable reasons, and who is attempting to build something meaningful from the wreckage of that choice. And how is that working? Miss Marple asked. Remarkably well, Victoria said with a slight smile. Not everyone has warmed to me. Mrs. Hartwell still makes occasional cutting remarks. Some people will never entirely forgive what I did, but the village has stopped seeing me as a tragedy or a scandal. I have become simply another resident with a complicated history. In a place like Thornfield, that is the highest form of acceptance available. As afternoon light began to lengthen, Miss Marple prepared to depart. But before she left, Victoria pressed something into her hands, a small, leather-bound journal. Edmund's botanical notes, Victoria explained. I found them when I was restoring the cottage. I thought you might appreciate them. Edmund was not a professional botanist, but his observations are quite detailed. He understood that gardens teach lessons about life, about timing, about patience, about the necessity of seasons and change. Miss Marple accepted the journal carefully. I will treasure it, she said. You should, Victoria replied. Because in many ways, this entire situation, Edmund's death, my imprisonment, the village's judgment and eventual acceptances documented in those pages. Edmund was preparing me, you see, from before I even arrived in Thornfield. He was teaching me to understand that growth requires both sunlight and shadow, that beauty emerges from careful attention to what seems small and ordinary. As Miss Marple walked back through the village toward her cottage, she found herself reflecting on the nature of mysteries and their resolution. The crime had been solved months ago. Victoria had shot Edmund. Elizabeth had poisoned his medications. James had attempted to obstruct justice. But the true mystery had always been something far more subtle. Why people acted as they did, and whether understanding those reasons could transform judgment into something approaching compassion. She had spent decades solving crimes, observing behavior, uncovering secrets, but what she had truly learned was that every human action contained multitudes layers of motivation, conflicting loyalties, competing versions of love and duty and survival. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden despite the chill of early spring, and she opened Edmund's journal. His handwriting was careful and precise. The writing of a man who understood that observation was the first step toward wisdom. One passage caught her immediate attention. The most important plants are not the ones that bloom most spectacularly, but those that endure through seasons of hardship. These are the plants that teach us about resilience. These are the plants that remind us that growth is not always visible, but it is always possible. Miss Marple closed the journal and looked out at her own garden, where spring was just beginning to assert itself. The roses would bloom again, as they always did. The village would continue its ancient rhythms, moving through seasons and cycles, each inhabitant carrying their own mysteries and secrets. And somewhere in Thornfield, Victoria Hartley would continue building her garden school, teaching others what she had learned through sacrifice and imprisonment and the slow, patient work of redemption. She would never be innocent in the eyes of those who knew her history. But perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, innocence was less important than integrity, the capacity to acknowledge what one had done and to continue living with grace despite that. Acknowledgement that as darkness fell and stars emerged in the spring sky, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The needles moved in their familiar rhythm, clicking steadily, producing patterns of order from thread and intention. and she thought about mysteries, not the ones that required solving through investigation and deduction, but the deeper mysteries of human nature that could never be entirely solved, only observed, understood, and occasionally forgiven. Thornfield slept peacefully beneath the stars, a village that had learned, through the tragedy of one woman's love and sacrifice, that redemption was possible. Not forgiveness, the village had not forgotten, but the more difficult and more valuable recognition that human beings were capable of growth, change, and the slow transformation of guilt into something approaching grace, and that, Miss Marple concluded as she set down her knitting at last, was perhaps the most important mystery of all, not how crime occurred, but how people survived it, and how communities learned to see each other clearly, despite or perhaps because of their most painful truths.